I'm Robert Klitzman. I am a professor of psychiatry, and I direct the Masters of Bioethics program. As a short word, we have some flyers if you're interested in that. We are delighted and deeply honored today to have Jeffrey Sachs, who will be speaking with us. This is part of a new initiative, which is a Center for Ethics, that several of us here in the room have been involved in talking to each other and with other people about, and which looks like it's going to go forward. We're very pleased with that. And when we discuss, and I should say, the reason for that I think is self-evident, that there are major ethical problems that we as a planet, as a society, as a university, as individuals face at every level, from ethics in the environment, obviously, to ethics and law, ethics in business, ethics in banking, ethics in big data, bioethics, of course, et cetera, et cetera. When a number of us as faculty and others got together to talk about it, one of the major issues that came up were ethics of the university, ethics of education. Here we are at an incredibly important point and place in which to help guide and forward ethical discussions across all these domains. And we were delighted when Jeffrey Sachs came up with the idea of having a series, of which this is the first, on what is a moral university in the 21st century. I would argue that no topic is as important, as timely, as relevant, particularly to those of us who are here in a major university. Jeffrey Sachs, I think, needs no introduction to any of you. He is the director of the Earth Institute here at Columbia University. He has been a special advisor to the United Nations on many projects, the director of many millennial projects, et cetera, et cetera. He's the author of at least 3 New York Times bestsellers, including The End of Poverty in 2005, Commonwealth Economics for a Crowded Planet, and The Price of Civilization. And his most recent book is To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace. He's on my short list for the Nobel Prize in Economics, and I think that of many other people. And please help me welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we just have to get you on the right committee. It's wonderful, and I'm really thrilled to be here among colleagues, friends, students to talk about an important topic. Moral discourse is not as normal as it should be, and it's not as easy as it might seem sometimes. So I actually wrote out my talk, which is very unusual for me because I wanted to try to get the words right. So I'm going to read, if you'll I apologize in advance, but because a subject like this requires as much clarity as possible, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow. So what is a moral university in the 21st century? I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak today on the question of what is a moral university in the 21st century, and I want to thank Dr. Robert Klitzman, professor of psychiatry and director of the Masters of Bioethics program at the Columbia University Medical Center, for taking the initiative to call the faculty together to examine this question. And I want to thank our many colleagues who have responded to that call. I hope that today's lecture will help us to move forward not only in debating the question, but also in helping Columbia University to be a moral university. As I will describe, I believe that we share the task of building a moral community, not so much in Kant's sense that we have the duty to do so, but in Aristotle's sense that by doing so we will flourish as a community and as individuals within it. In one sense, it should be obvious to all of us that questions of this university's moral code are with us every day in a staggering number of ways. Consider some of the issues faced by the members of the Columbia University community in recent years. Should Columbia University divest from fossil fuels? How should Columbia University handle allegations of sexual harassment and sexual assault? How should the university discipline students in cases of cheating and plagiarism? What does Columbia owe to the community in Morningside Heights and Manhattanville? How should Columbia manage the intellectual property developed on the campus? Should it make drug patents that it holds available to the public? Should university researchers use animal subjects in their research, and if so, under what conditions? Who should gain admission to the university? Those with top test scores, children of alumni, children of wealthy donors, students of color, American or foreign students? Should Columbia boycott Israel or other countries because of their human rights policies? Which donor money should the university accept, and which should it refuse, if any? Should the university invite speakers notorious for their hate speech in the service of free speech, or does that legitimize hate? Should the faculty be free to offer their services to Wall Street, the CIA, ExxonMobil, or anybody else of their personal choice? And if so, are the limits of those choices completely personal, up to the one-day-a-week consultancy reserved for faculty, and with suitable disclosures might be required? These questions and countless more are all questions of should. And that should, I will argue, is a moral consideration. That is, these are moral questions, and it is important, in my view, that we treat them as moral questions. This claim is not self-evident. Indeed, I would suggest that it is not even the normal approach today. Many of these questions are handled en passant, according to administrative procedures, state and federal law, public relations, department policies made on the run, or through traditions, emulation, or improvisation, without addressing their moral content. There are many who, quite understandably, would argue that we shouldn't enter the moral thicket. Let's be pragmatic, they would say. Columbia is a diverse community in a diverse city, country, and world. We are here at Columbia for practical reasons: to study, to teach, to do research, or to earn a living. These tasks are hard enough, replete with struggles and challenges enough to achieve basic functionality, civility, and financial solvency. Let's get on with our work to the best we can, keeping the campus pleasant and quiet by leaving morality to the moralizers and philosophical debates to the philosophy department. Some might go further to say that moral debates are dead ends, endless eddies of opinions masquerading as high principles, personality differences reflected in opposing philosophical stances. One person's claim to defend Palestinians' rights is another person's anti-Semitism. One person's attack on a corporate donor is another person's meddling in the university's business affairs that they just can't begin to fathom. One faculty member's Wall Street consulting fees are a conflict of interest for some, a purely personal choice for others, or a way to gain practical knowledge for still others. They are the university's business, or they are nobody else's business than the faculty member himself. Moral debate can elevate the community, some would say, or it can hopelessly divide the community and divert it from our day jobs. In considering these debates, we sometimes feel like the observer to the heated Talmudic dispute. The first student argues his case to the rabbi. "You're right," says the rabbi. The second argues the diametrically opposed case. "You're right," says the rabbi. The third student protests, "But rabbi, they can't both be right." "You're right," says the rabbi. Let me state what I would regard as, quote, the default position in our moral deliberations within the university, and I would suggest also in American society at large. As a practical matter, Columbia University is governed by its Board of Trustees as empowered by an 1810 charter under the laws of the state of New York, and with all the property for the sole use and benefit for the university. It is also subject to the harsh laws of market competition and academic competition. As one of the world's major research universities, we have two main jobs to do: to teach and to pursue new ideas. For that, a group of students, faculty, administrators, and staff are organized around a remarkably complex set of voluntary contractual relations, ultimately governed by the statutes of the university and the contract laws of New York State and the United States. Those contracts determine tuition payments, government grants, employment contracts and terms of service, and countless rights and responsibilities of the staff, researchers, teachers, and students. Our moral obligations in this view are largely defined by our obligations to those voluntary contracts, and by implication to the underlying laws that define and defend those contracts, acknowledging some special legal relationships of universities vis-a-vis students as, quote, facilitators of student development. To push morality further than the web of contractual relations and contract law is to court trouble, lots of it, according to this view. We have different opinions, backgrounds, and purposes. We are here not to like each other, necessarily, though there are friendships galore. We are not here to agree. We are here to accomplish our tasks, whether to get a degree, uncover a new law of nature, invent a new device, produce a work of art, understand the past in a new way, or heal a patient in the university's vast medical complex. We are here to keep focus and to keep moving. Individual members of the community are encouraged to hold strong views, often trenchant and controversial ones, but they should not implicate the rest of us in those choices. According to this view, let Columbia, as a web of voluntary contractual relations, support its core purposes, pay its bills, and keep the safety and civility on campus. Let me call this the libertarian position. I would argue that it has become the benchmark of moral reasoning in our community, and indeed in the nation. And in a country that was born in the defense of liberty, albeit originally liberty for those with white skins, it has long been the default position, viewed not only as the practical limit to moral reasoning, but as the practical method of living in a state of high social, ethnic, class, and religious diversity. I want to suggest today why this position is not enough, why American society increasingly suffers from the encroachment of this libertarian position into all nooks and crannies of society, and why Columbia University and all other complex organizations within our society suffer as well. But more than that, I want to speak about the special role that moral deliberation and standards should have at a great university like ours. We are not just another institution in American society, another corporation or non-governmental organization or public agency. We are a university, one of our nation's oldest and grandest, with attributes that put us in a special position of morality and responsibility vis-a-vis the rest of society. Our own well-being and America's well-being, and now even the world's well-being, are affected by the quality of moral discourse and moral choices on our nation's campuses. To defend that position, I want to be clear about another. Almost all of us are out of practice in moral reasoning. Moral reasoning, like other kinds of specialized knowledge, is an undertaking that requires training, practice, and experience. Indeed, Aristotle argued that only the older members of the polis, the community, could have phronesis, often defined as practical wisdom, including moral wisdom. This is a position I increasingly subscribe to now that I have celebrated my 60th birthday this year. I am not, therefore, suggesting that moral deliberations on campus could be quick or easy or painless. We are mostly out of practice and will be out of breath and literally out of words on many occasions as once again we limber up our moral muscles. Yet limber up we must if we are to thrive. Let me also define some terms. By morality, I will mean a framework of guiding principles and a means of decision-making that our community should develop and hone in order to answer questions of should. That moral code, I will argue, was built upon and alongside an ethical disposition. By ethics here, I will refer to principles of individual behavior as members of the Columbia community to pursue the right kind of life within our community. Our own ethical behavior is key to a successful moral community. Of course, our ethical standards of members of the Columbia community will be somewhat distinct from our ethical standards in other spheres, such as citizens. Let me begin by identifying 4 types of moral problems that we face. In my short remarks, I can't hope to do more than touch upon a tiny fraction of them. Indeed, I will limit my remarks to only the last of the 4 types of moral problems, hoping that other colleagues in talks that will follow will take up some of the other pressing issues. First, we face the moral challenges of daily life within the Columbia community. We live, work, and interact here, for many of us spending a majority of our waking hours on the campus and in our university endeavors. Here, the moral questions involve our relations with each other. What are the moral boundaries of free speech on campus, of sexual practices and responsibilities, of civility and collegiality, of the internal governance of our university affairs, including hiring and firing, admissions, disciplinary actions, access to health care, job security, physical security, due process, non-discrimination, and countless other dimensions of daily life, both private and professional, yet pursued as part of the Columbia community. Second, we face the moral challenges of academic researchers in a world-leading research center. What are the moral standards for academic inquiry? How shall research protocols be devised to protect subjects? Who owns the fruits of research? The researcher, the university, or society at large? Do research subjects have any moral claims to the fruits of research, up to and including their own body cells and parts used in that research? What are the standards for truth and objectivity in our work, and how should those be deliberated? Are these to be guided wholly by the marketplace of ideas or by internal standards? What are the ethical requirements for the individual conscience of a Columbia researcher? Third, we face the moral challenges of teachers. As teachers, mentors, and advisors, we have special moral responsibilities in imparting knowledge, including moral knowledge, to our students. In my field, economics, a growing student movement in the US and Europe holds that mainstream economics instruction is not only epistemologically deficient, but even morally suspect. By what standards, including moral standards, might such claims be evaluated and acted upon? Fourth, we face the moral challenges of a research and teaching institution within the broader US society, and in the 21st century, a globalized society. What special moral obligations should universities assume and defend as part of a broader and highly diverse society? Universities have, of course, and rightly so, long been among the staunchest defenders in society of the moral principle of free speech, knowing as we do that free speech is a core and critical value of effective research and pedagogy. Yet our moral challenges as part of society go far beyond the defense of our own terrain and ideas. How should the university address the moral content of its countless contractual relations beyond our own community? I am thinking about the relations with donors, with corporate funders, with outside employers of the faculty who engage in their one-day-a-week consultancy arrangements, and with the company shares in the university endowment. I am also thinking about our relations with our own local community on Morningside Heights and Manhattanville, and with communities halfway around the world, in South America, Africa, and Asia. Must we be actively engaged with such communities to be fulfilling our moral purpose? Some have argued, even aggressively, for the university to protect its core functions by remaining within the ivory tower. Others have asserted that the university finds its meaning and core truths by engaging actively in society at large. We honor this month the passing of a great university leader, Notre Dame's president, Father Theodore Hesburgh, who a half-century ago put the issue this way, and I quote, "Can the university, its faculty, students, or administrators be indifferent to such problems as racial equality, demography, the world rule of law, the deteriorating relations between science and other humanities, the moral foundations of democracy, the true nature of communism, the understanding of non-Western cultures, the values and goals of our society? These are real problems," continues Father Hesburgh, "of intellectual content, of urgent consequence, of frightening proportions. Where are they going to be studied in all of their dimensions? And where are truly ultimate solutions to be elaborated, if not in that one institution that is committed to the mind at work, using all of the disciplines and intellectual skills available? In my remaining remarks, I will focus on this fourth of the challenges of the moral relations between the university and the broader community. I want to argue that for the university to flourish, and for us to flourish within it, we should adopt a moral perspective in our dealings with the rest of the world, and an ethical perspective in our individual capacities as members of Columbia University engaged with the broader world. I want to argue in particular here against several variants of the libertarian position, which I have stated earlier and which I will now summarize again. The libertarian position holds, in essence, that our moral practice should lie in the pursuit of contractual relations that advance the core interests of individual members of the community in their work as students, teachers, and researchers. Moral positions beyond that, including moral claims made by the university in its dealings with the outside world, should be highly circumspect and limited. So goes this view. The university should not presume to speak for the members of the Columbia community on political issues such as Israel and Palestine, climate change, inequality of income, or other contentious issues that divide society, including the Columbia community, and that are ancillary to the core activities of the university. Harvard President Drew Faust recently advanced such a position in rejecting the call by a Harvard student group for divestment of the Harvard portfolio from fossil fuels. Let me quote from President Faust at some length, and I quote, "Harvard is an academic institution. It exists to serve an academic mission, to carry out the best possible programs of education and research. We hold our endowment funds in trust to advance that mission, which is the university's distinctive way of serving society. The funds in the endowment have been given to us by generous benefactors over many years to advance academic aims, not to serve other purposes, however worthy. As such, we maintain a strong presumption against divesting investment assets for reasons unrelated to the endowment's financial strength and its ability to advance our academic goals. We should, moreover, be very wary of steps intended to instrumentalize our endowment in ways that would appear to position the university as a political actor rather than an academic institution. Conceiving of the endowment not as an economic resource, but as a tool to inject the university into the political process, or as a lever to exert economic pressure for social purposes, can entail serious risks to the independence of the academic enterprise. The endowment is a resource, not an instrument to impel social or political change." President Faust does acknowledge in her letter the importance of climate change and the intention of Harvard University to be a responsible investor, albeit under the strictures just stated. I believe Faust's position to be morally wrong and ultimately corrosive of Harvard University and the wider society. Let me explain. To do so, I must very briefly address some basic ideas about the economy and voluntary contracting, such as between the university and its donors, or between ExxonMobil and its customers. The general idea that prevails in Faust's discourse, as well as in bad economics textbooks, is that the endowment is strictly an economic instrument, not a political instrument. It is a resource for pursuing the aims of its owner, in this case the education and research mission of Harvard, without so-called political constraints. Faust warns against, quote, instrumentalizing, unquote, the endowment for political reasons precisely so that it can be instrumentalized for narrow economic reasons alone. But what is the difference morally between an economic reason and a political reason? Using the endowment for an economic reason to fund education and research abides by the idea that each resource owner, in this case Harvard University, has the moral right to dispose of its assets to pursue its own special purposes, free of broader, indeed society-wide claims other than those embedded in the governing legal framework. Law, voluntary contract, and one's own purposes largely guide the disposition of resources. That, of course, is the prevailing textbook picture of the market economy. There is a competing moral vision to which I subscribe and believe that we should subscribe, and that is that the economy and our material resources within it should operate within a broader moral framework, one that extends beyond individual contracts, private property, and prevailing law. There are transcendent moral purposes in society. Voluntary contracts may lead us badly astray, even to the threat of our own survival and the survival of other moral beings. The Roman Catholics call this moral framework the universal destination of goods. The Jews call it justice, to not do to others what you would not have them do to you, which Hillel famously described as the core of Torah. Kant called it the categorical imperative, to behave according to only those maxims that can be universal laws. And Bentham called it utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. The content of these moral claims may differ in each of these versions, as does the source of morality, secular or God-given. Yet the assumption of a governing moral framework is undoubted. The moral framework exists in all of these modes of moral inquiry because the sum of individual behavior is not enough to meet human needs, unless guided, molded, and constrained by a larger moral purpose. In modern social science and evolutionary biology, we call it the problem of social dilemmas. What is good for the individual is not necessarily good for the society. One may say that the core purpose of moral reasoning is to align the individual action and the social good. Morality teaches us, encourages us, cajoles us to adopt, quote, pro-social behaviors, or what Kant deemed to be maxims that can be applied universally, or what my mother told me to be a mensch. Of all of the schools of moral thought, I am most partial to Aristotle, for he begins rightly and wisely with man as a social animal. In modern British and American thought, morality starts and too often ends with the protection of the individual from the rest of society. Libertarianism is, after all, the doctrine that puts individual choice ahead of all other moral values. Aristotle starts the other way around, that before we are individuals, we are members of the community. Rather than the community only serving to protect the individual from abuses, as in Anglo-Saxon political philosophy and libertarian doctrine, Aristotle held that each individual has the purpose, the telos, to mold himself to be a good citizen, a good member of the polis. For Aristotle, morality is built upon the ethics of the citizenry, and ethics involves the pursuit of virtue, or arete, each individual's pursuit of excellence as a member of the political community. Through that pursuit, promoted by moral education, mentoring, and practice, the individual learns to pursue a high moral standard, and through that achieves eudaimonia, the condition of happiness or flourishing. So let me return to the endowment and fossil fuels. We should understand that fossil fuel use is a social dilemma. It makes sense for the individual, but not for the society as a whole, at least not at the current and projected future scales. Indeed, for society as a whole, the prevailing way of using fossil fuels is ruinous, already claiming lives of the poor abroad through droughts, floods, and extreme tropical cyclones, and threatening our very survival in the future. Since I have no time to elaborate, I will refer you to the wondrous recent work led by our colleague, Professor James Hansen, who summarizes the work of the scientific community with many of the key scientific advances coming from our own university research. Yet how is the social good to be achieved? In principle, at least since Bentham, we focus on legislation and treaties, in this case to phase out fossil fuel use during the 21st century. Yet how is that legislation to be brought about? Each economic actor today says that the problem is not really their own. The Harvard Endowment should not get into the political thicket. ExxonMobil says that it must maximize the value of its shareholders' wealth. Many libertarians, wary of government engagement at all, simply try to deny the climate science so as to preserve maximum space for individual liberty. We thereby arrive at what Pope Francis recently called the globalization of indifference in his exhortation Evangelii Gaudium. The moral problems are not my own. Problems of hunger, poverty, climate change, inequality, suffering belong somewhere else, not here. Social dilemmas go unaddressed. Pro-social behavior is hardly recognized, much less championed. Choosing to divest from fossil fuels is part of overcoming the globalization of indifference. Together with Lisa Sachs of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, I have recently proposed specific steps on divestment that might be termed responsible investment and conditional divestment, and the details are available online. My view about our moral predicament is not in the abstract, and my cry of o tempora o mores is not as ageless and therefore cliched as it might feel. America is in moral decline, and demonstrably so. Trust in American society is in decline. Trust in each other, trust in our government. Every opinion survey shows it. Only 35% of Americans believe that, quote, most other people can be trusted, down from 45% in the early 1980s. In Scandinavia, the generalized trust is nearly twice as high, between 60 and 70%, and has increased, not decreased, during the past 3 decades. The low regard for the U.S. federal government and the perception of pervasive corruption is equally telling. As a general matter, I believe that this decline reflects the extension of economic instrumentality into every form of social activity. Government is for sale at every election. Reputation is for purchase by the image makers and lobbyists. The marquee Wall Street firms have paid around $100 billion in fines and settlements against charges of financial fraud and other misdeeds in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. And the universities, as big and very expensive businesses within society, have hardly been immune. Corporate money has infiltrated the core of our university life. Big Pharma funds a considerable amount of research activity, which is now turned into big profits through sky-high drug prices and fat returns to patents. Wall Street funds many faculty and programs of the economics department, the business school, and the law schools of major universities. Big donors such as the Koch brothers push libertarian ideas through massive funding of ideologically driven university programs around the country. Here is what a recent book, Deadly Monopolies, says about the economic culture at our medical schools. And I quote, "Once a collaborative haven for independent inquiry and pure research, the University Medical Research Center is today just another arena of commercial corporate endeavor that takes competition seriously enough to deal harshly with disloyalty and raiding to the point of seeking to send former colleagues to prison," unquote. There have been many recent scandals of leading academic faculty on the hidden pay of Big Pharma to tout various medicines, such as the 3 Harvard Medical School psychiatrists who were on the disclosed generous pay of pharmaceutical companies to promote antipsychotic drugs for young children. In response, Harvard banned the professors for 1 year of consultancy fees. A lighter tap on the wrist one couldn't imagine. The feverish quest for patent returns in academia contrasts with very different behavior in the past. The same book quotes Benjamin Franklin noting that, quote, "As we enjoy great advantages from the invention of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours, and we should do so freely and generously," unquote. It reminds us also that Nobel laureate Selman Waksman of Rutgers, ensured that Rutgers would hold the patent to his discovery of streptomycin and would sell it cheaply and generically. And it repeats the famous and wonderful line of Jonas Salk, who replied to Edward R. Murrow's question as to who owns the patent to Salk's polio vaccine. Quote, "The American people, I guess. Could you patent the sun?" Does the rampant commercialization of all aspects of American society and much of academic life matter for the purposes of the university, the fulfillment of our telos? I believe it does. Remember the expose inside job and our own university's engagement in the misdeeds of the financial sector. Consider that at Harvard University, Lawrence Summers engaged in large-scale financial consulting both before and after his stints as President Obama's economic advisor. Did this raise the public's confidence in the university and in the sanctity of public policy? I think not. Or consider another esteemed Harvard economist, Jeremy Stein, who last year left his position at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington to return to the university, but has already lined up a plush consultancy contract with a major hedge fund. This comes just months after his departure from the Fed. I watched close up how Harvard handled a financial conflict of interest of an economics department faculty member a decade ago. There was never a moment of public reflection by the Harvard leadership on the behavior of a professor that left Harvard with a fine paid to the U.S. government of around $30 million. In the time-tested style of a public relations gambit, Harvard simply proceeded without any moral discourse or self-reflection. As one professor put it, quote, "It's often said that the university won't comment on the behavior of individual members of the faculty, and I, to some degree, respect that perspective, but this is taking that principle a little too far," unquote. And as for the economics department, the faculty did not accept or even comprehend the ethical issues. One department colleague put it in this way, quote, "We think about him not as the guy who was involved in the AID lawsuit. We think about him as the exciting, intellectually active colleague that we've always known," end quote. What then shall we do as a moral community in the face of moral crisis? We should strive to revive moral discourse as a university community, drawing on the experts within our own community in philosophy, psychology, evolutionary biology, religion, culture, the arts, politics, sociology, and yes, even economics, to give us the vocabulary, concepts, and debates to deepen our moral understanding and bearings. Our unique core curriculum is an invaluable asset for students and faculty alike in this regard. We should take up important moral challenges in the university's relations with the broader world, including divestment policies, corporate university relations, treatment of intellectual property owned by the university, and our commitments to the poor within our midst and around the world. We should encourage a remoralization of U.S. society at large, to pull back from an America in which inequalities are at all-time highs, in which everything is for sale, in which Wall Street commits financial crimes and then pays fines as a normal cost of doing business, and in which the U.S. Supreme Court cannot tell the difference between anonymous corporate campaign giving and free speech. If ever there were a demonstration of the collapse of U.S. public morality, it is the Supreme Court's disastrous moral failure in Citizens United and related case law. My message, colleagues, is that morality counts. It counts for our intellectual purposes. It counts for our souls. As Aristotle thought of his beloved polis, we should think of our beloved university. This is our community and a vital source of our meaning as individuals and professionals. What we do here matters for ourselves, each other, and society. Morality matters because otherwise we succumb to social dilemmas that foment distrust, corruption, and ultimately violence. And as the great sages from Buddha to Aristotle to Jesus taught us, morality is ultimately the path to a life worth living. Thank you very much.
speech, really words for action. So we're going to open the floor up in one moment. I just want to say, this is the mundane. If you could just sign in, that would be great.
It's your obligation.
Yes. The floor is now open.
In your conversations, somewhat skewed to economics, but I would like your definition of moral equivalence. And that is something that has been plaguing the university with what happened at Brandeis with Ali Hirsi. And is there such a thing as moral equivalence? And if so, what is your thinking in that regard?
I don't really know the sense in which it was used in her case. The equivalence of what?
Well,
I don't remember exactly.
Well, she was accused of being she had these terrible experiences. She's day by day, word by getting killed. This was about Islam, and they said, well, it's she of course feels that Islam is a religion that has, from beginning, middle, and end, has a violent nature to it. And of course, the Jews and Christianity that too, but it had information. And she was going to talk on it, and stopped her from talking.
No. Well, let me just say, first of all, that in general, for reasons I alluded to, the ability to speak on campus, I think, should be defended as a pretty bedrock value. So I thought it was fine for Ahmadinejad to be here speaking, as repulsive as he is. It is actually a good idea for the university to open its space to a very wide range of speakers. Now, she is not repulsive in that way. She has strong views. The idea that she should not appear and speak on a campus is, to my mind, a real derangement of moral reasoning. Of course, she should be free to speak on a campus, and she should express her views and explain them. I don't share that sentiment about Islam, I must say, because like any of the great religions, what a complete universe of realities religion encompasses, from the good, the bad, to the ugly, in all of the religions. And in this sense, I'd be a little worried about some of her statements and precepts. I don't share them, but I'd be perfectly happy to both have a cup of coffee with her and to hear her speak and to welcome her to speak. So this is, again, the basic point of our intellectual inquiry as being a core of our purpose, and our, I think, correct understanding that goes for several centuries, that open inquiry is pretty decisive for correct analysis. Let me say one other thing on the substance of the religion and Islam part, because it is something I come into contact with a lot. I'm working in probably at least 24 Muslim countries, for example. I work closely with the Islamic Development Bank. I would say, on a substantive matter, I would reject any generalizations that are anti-Islamic. I think it's kind of ignorance of the other. And I would say that the most powerful trait that we have as humanity is our group identity tendencies and our ability quickly to see the worst and fear the worst of the other. And that, the evolutionary psychologists tell us, is very deeply rooted. In-group camaraderie and outer group threat and hostility, and I see it all the time. And I must say that I think one of Jesus's cleverest statements was about seeing the mote in the eye of the other without realizing the beam in one's own eye. That is that we're very bad in general, biologically bad, at empathy, and we're very, very quick to categorize identity. And as someone who's worked in 130 countries in the world, if you do that, by the way, it's over for you anyway, because you can't even function in most of the world. But the truth is, the ability to function all over the world is extremely high if you treat people with respect. And if you avoid the stereotyping, we would get way ahead. By the way, we would save trillions of dollars in the stupid wars that we have fought over the years. Please.
Isn't becoming the first moral university, like the first country to unilaterally renounce nuclear weapons? I mean, how can we do it in a winner-take-all capitalist society where everybody would be too happy to eat our meat?
Yeah. Very carefully. I think that on certain issues, for example, divestment, if there are costs, I don't think that they're large at all. And I think that the benefits of us taking a clear understanding and stand are worth it. So I don't regard that as a high economic cost. In fact, I regard the petroleum sector as a pretty lousy investment. And if we had divested a year ago, we would have saved a lot of money, actually, with the fall of oil prices. So that's a relatively easy part. The harder part comes with corporate donations, partnerships, and so forth. It is by nature that we are beggars as a university. Well, there are two models, actually. One is that we're in business, and that's what I'm arguing against. And the logical implication of what I'm arguing is that we live our lives as beggars. And that, I feel, is the right stance for us to take. That basically we want to say we generate knowledge and we give it away as best we can. We do charge tuition, but I'm not too happy about the patents, even though without the patent flow, there would be no Earth Institute. It was the patent flow that funded the Earth Institute, so I don't want to be naive about this. But I do think as a society, we're in a very bad direction. And I have recently written about sofosbuvir, the hepatitis C vaccine, which is abusive beyond abuse in pricing and in adverse consequences because sick people are not getting treated. And a pill that costs $100 I'm sorry, not $100, it costs, oh my God, $10, I guess, a pill, should not be selling for $1,000 a pill because of the strange rules that we have, not to mention the fact that NIH paid for the research of it all the way through. It's a long story. I'd be happy to go into more detail. But it does suggest to me that we do have to get out of this commercial model if we're going to fulfill our deeper role. I'm not against taking contributions. I'm in favor of, I beg for a living. Any rich person or company that goes by, I ask them for something. Most of the time they look at me in a strange way. Often they look at me and they say, aren't you the SOB that wrote that nasty piece about us last month? And sometimes they say, we'd be happy to contribute, you're doing useful work. I think that's the stance we need to live on. We need to tell our alumni to give us more money, by the way. That's also a moral claim. I'm very much on the side of Andrew Carnegie in The Social Gospel of Wealth, where he said that for a rich person to die with money is a shame, a moral shame, he said, because people should give away their money during their lifetime. I'm trying to help people live up to Carnegie's moral vision in every possible way. Right. So I don't think that it's a simple answer, and I don't want to derail a functioning financial structure, but I don't want us to go business as usual, because we're losing in the last most protected part of society, because I think universities really are extraordinarily special. We're losing that boundary now. And I can also, this is a little bit tangential, but it's related. Exactly 30 years ago this year, I was asked for the first time to do something practical. I was already tenured, and then I was asked by former students in Bolivia to do something practical to help on an economic crisis in Bolivia. And I did the work. Fortunately, it worked out. But one of the things that I discovered along the way, which was the opposite of my view from afar, was that this was an impoverished country that needed its debts canceled because it was living at subsistence and it was a misery, and they needed the money more than the harsh treatment that was being applied to try to squeeze out the payments. And it wasn't working. It was just leading to social destabilization. Not unlike Greece today, by the way, but even a poorer setting. Interestingly for me, when I wrote this, a colleague stopped me in the well of Littauer Center, which was the Harvard Economics Department center, and said, so-and-so on the corporation really doesn't like your opinion. I just thought I should tell you that as a friend, Jeff. And the Harvard Corporation is 7 people. It's quite rarefied, and this was a leading international banker and a big muckety-muck at Harvard, as you could imagine. And I was afraid. But I remember standing in the stairwell, sweat everywhere, and I thought, but God, they gave me tenure just now. And it was an incredibly liberating moment and realization for me. I've used it to be obnoxious ever since. It is an incredible privilege that some of us are lucky to have. But I think it comes with a very heavy responsibility to try to tell the truth at all times. And that, unfortunately, gets me involved in saying things about some of our benefactors, our donors, and so on, which I think needs to be said. It is a problem. I don't have an easy answer. I think we have to make our way through our returns to society, and those returns come in many shapes and forms. I'm also interested in pushing the envelope that we're out there in the communities directly solving some practical problems, downstream problems, as well as the upstream knowledge as part of how we contribute to society, and therefore as part of our moral claim on society's resources. So I also believe that there are other things we should do as a university, opening centers in Africa or in poor countries, solving those problems that some people feel, although fewer and fewer, feel is outside the ken of the university, too practical, too downstream. I think it's both part of our responsibility in the same sense that Father Hesburgh said, who else? And also I learned over time that I wasn't clever enough to figure out things theoretically, that I had to have my hands dirty, even from a pure epistemological point of view, to understand what the heck I was doing. It would be a little bit like being a doctor and never seeing a patient. You'd be... Yeah, well, but you see the inside of them, right? So in this sense, my answer is, if we behave ourselves very well, we should be prudent but not afraid. We should state clearly why we are holding the positions we're holding. That's the moral seriousness, and we should beg, beg, beg. Please.
Will your talk be published or available?
Absolutely, yeah.
So you've alluded to it in your talk you published before about kind of the need to engage with divestment, regarding divestment, shareholder engagement, and kind of picking and choosing companies to divest from that have made them that are divesting from companies that won't kind of respond to real science and respond to kind of our scientific understanding of climate change. I was wondering if you could discuss the morality of that versus kind of a more general divestment of all fossil fuel companies and how kind of the latter is a more practical, urgent response, that morality compares to maybe a more nuanced, long-term approach.
So this is a tactical question as well as a moral question. I wrote with my daughter, who heads the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at the law school, a piece on divestment and what to do. I should say within our team, she was pushing me more towards the responsible investor position. I was pushing more towards the straight divestment position. Within the family, we worked it out. And I'm very comfortable with the position that we have, I should say. I think she improved my argumentation a lot. So what we said specifically was, you can't duck the issue. Drew Faust is not right to say, this is the endowment, leave us alone, let's not get into the midst of this. This is a first-order moral issue because it's about responsibility at a very deep way and the future of the planet. It cannot be ducked. It's why Pope Francis will issue an encyclical on climate change this summer, not as a PLOS scientific paper, but because it's a moral issue. So that's the starting point. Then comes the method. We recommended 2 steps: asking companies a series of questions, and if they failed to pass the test, divesting. But if they pass the test, staying within the portfolio. And the questions, broadly speaking, are first, do you believe in the science of climate change? And probably most would pass that test at this point. Second is, do you subscribe to the globally agreed limit of 2 degrees C warming? That's what has been agreed by governments in 2009. That's a tough test. The reason that we put it on the list is that when Exxon and Chevron were asked about that, they said, oh, we don't think that that will ever be met. They didn't answer whether they believed in it or not, but they brushed it aside. Well, that's moral hazard, to just brush it aside, since they're major determinants of whether it will or won't be met. So the second question is, do you believe in the 2 degree Celsius limit? Third, are you prepared to act on that in a variety of ways? First of all, not being part of lobbying groups, such as American Petroleum Institute, which lobbies against action. They wouldn't meet with me when I requested a meeting, and they should meet with me. Other similar actions. And fourth, are you still a good investment in a fossil fuel constrained world? Show us why we should still even dream to hold your portfolio. Maybe you're just an extinct company that should just phase out. So those were the 4 tests. My view is that if you pass those 4 tests, first, the company is behaving in a moral sense. And second, it's plausible that that's a good direction to go. In fact, it could be an added help, and we'll see. I'm not completely, I think time will tell, but several companies in Europe right now are about to make a statement along these lines. Statoil, Eni, Total, BP, Shell, probably Saudi Aramco, and others. I don't know who it'll be in the end, but a group of the leading companies are about to state the right position. I really like that, because it will change the political discourse in all our countries. This idiotic newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, which is a purely immoral editorial page. It's lying, cheating, propaganda, will be exposed. And it should be exposed. That's part of how a moral code has to operate, which is you call out the immoral actors. If the oil companies will do the calling out, wonderful. That will really help. So as a tactic, that seems right to me as a next step of the process, and I would love to see the oil companies join. What's interesting, by the way, is that the American companies are not part of this group yet. But this is American society. We are way down the road in our amoral or immoral behavior at a social level. Very different from other contexts in the world. Our companies are ready to say anything. That's their normal default behavior at this point. Wall Street, I have said repeatedly, has been a cesspool of corruption. They cheat and lie for a living. And I'm not speaking hyperbolically, I'm speaking $100 billion of fines later. They cheat because it's part of their normal business expense. They get away with it, it's a slap on the wrist, they go on doing it. Many major American companies that I deal with will not tell the truth in public right now about climate change. They'll say in private, oh, it's really hard, the Washington environment. What does it mean, the Washington environment? It probably means that they're lobbying for tax privileges and they'll mess it up if they say something honest. That's what it probably means. So we're quite advanced in this kind of moral failure. And getting some companies on the right side, I think, can be a big advantage. In general, my heart's with the divestment campaign, though, obviously. So it's not against it. It's only a question of the tactics for proceeding. There's a lot more to say. Actually, just one more thing. A true climate change process is itself a complicated process. What to do? We wouldn't shut down the companies tomorrow, even if we could. We would phase them out over decades. Even if we could shut them down tomorrow, it would not be the right thing to do. What would be the right thing to do would be to stop Arctic drilling, ultra-deep sea drilling, the Keystone Pipeline, the oil sands. There's no place in a 2-degree C world for that stuff. So that would stop immediately, but the companies would continue for a while. And that makes it also a little bit more complicated on saying, what are you really pushing for? I'm pushing for a pathway to achieve our climate goals. Please.
So that was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
How are you?
How are you, Jeff? Good to see you. However, I have a question. It seems to me, and I agree with you completely on President Faust's position. It seems to me that that's actually a moral position masquerading as neutrality. So, but in your talk, I also thought that you oscillated in the way in which you alluded to the subject of the moral university. And at times, I thought it was the morality of the professoriate, or the morality of the intellectual leadership of the university that was the issue, and therefore highly individualized. And at other times, I thought you were really talking about the university as a corporate entity, as when you're talking about divestment. So my question to you is, in fact, most of us, or many of us, will think in some kind of moral terms. But the real problem that we have, it seems to me, are two. One is how to legitimate moral discourse as a parameter of collective choice in the university. And secondly, how to constitute the university as a moral subject, which I think actually calls into question a lot of procedural issues and questions about whose morality are we going to be presenting as the morality of Columbia? Who's going to set the parameters for that discussion and how?
Great. So a lot of the focus of my remarks was on this category of the university inherently behaving as a corporate identity vis-a-vis the outside world, taking grants, holding companies, and so forth. And in that case, we behave as in a corporate identity inherently because it's corporate business that's being constructed, and I'm talking about putting the moral code around that. That's easy. That's the easy part of the answer to your question, because if the university is behaving in its corporate in its corporate identity, then the morality of that corporate identity is easier to discuss. But I also mentioned these three other major categories which I didn't describe at length, other than to mention some of the issues, which is the university as a community. That is precisely not the university acting in a corporate identity, but as a group of individuals in voluntary association. And so that's where I said the issues of HR, the issues of free speech within the community, the issues of hiring and firing, job security, internal governance, the role of the faculty and students in governance, and so on, come to the forefront. And that really is the morality of the university as a community. I left that to others to examine at greater length. So remember I said morality as a community, which is, I think, a lot of the questions you're asking. Second, the morality of research and inquiry. Third, the morality of teaching. And fourth, the morality of the university and its corporate relations with the outside world. Those were the four categories I could think of. And I only touched on the fourth, really. But I do think the internal dynamics which you're talking about, which is whose morality and how do we live in the community, and is crucial. And that's where I also think it's absolutely vital that we discuss issues in moral terms. We learn, again, together to use the vocabulary of moral reasoning much better than we do right now. We don't duck behind PR and administrative and this is the law and this is the way that it needs to be. We come forward and say, as a community, there should be a moral code within our community. So, but we're at very early days for reconstituting that kind of moral discourse, I think.
I have time for one more question, please.
It's more as a follow-on question. So there was a lot of pressure from the university community for Columbia to take a position on Ferguson, the events in Ferguson.
On Ferguson, yeah.
How do we do that? Like what is the mechanism by which this community could take a position, given that there are diverse positions on any issue?
Yeah.
How do we do that?
I think that there are probably 2 or 3 things that I would recommend off the top of my head. One is that when we're confronted with major issues like that, we should, first of all, do what we do very well, which is organize internal deliberations in a number of ways. And that really is our specialty. We're just great at talking, great at rooms, seminars, teach-ins, workshops, invited speakers, and so forth. We should make that effort. That would be number one. Second, if there is within the community a strong feeling for action, I think I would test that in this context by seeing whether in these meetings and in faculty senate and other ways there is a kind of consensus. And third, I think that the president has both a podium and space and a calling and need to speak out on issues like this, which is not simple, and it's not necessarily embodying the views of everyone in the community, and Lee would make that very clear. But we also crave that in a way. I'm not saying on that particular issue, but in general, that we have a moral discourse, that we are reminded in the community of right and wrong, that we have an intelligent discussion about it, which of course we have a gifted president who could make such a discussion, and that he would take pains to try to define the boundaries of who he's speaking for and how he's speaking. But I would use that pulpit to preach. I think it's important to do so. And again, I think preparing the base for that, not we need a statement every day, what's the university's position on that? I don't think that's good for us. We're pretty slow moving. I don't think we have to divest yesterday. I do like our deliberative mode. I think it's one of our specialties. We are supposed to be one of the few thinking places in society. But I do think building up a position, a response, an answer, a feeling for the community, the short term can be an emotional statement, which can be very important for feeling of safety, recognizing the sense of injustice or outrage or concern and so forth. But the more deliberate position should come after deliberation. And I think we should strive to do that more than we do. We do it some, but we don't talk enough among ourselves as a community. I've almost never had, in the Earth Institute, quite a bit of nice discussions. I remember in the Harvard Economics Department, just to go back, obviously I don't have warm feelings for a lot of what I saw. We never once had a discussion about economics in the economics department, just as a factual statement. We had seminars. The speaker would come in. The job was to rip the person apart. That was the prevailing mode, as it is in our workshops, but not deep internal engagement, reflection, deliberation, and so on. I miss that because I think that it could be one of the great ways for us to enrich our lives more, and that's why I love being here, because we're having that kind of discussion, which is quite unusual in general to have.
Well, we said to go till 7:30. I'm sure we can keep going, but why don't we stick to the time? I'm sure if you were around, people could continue to ask questions. And please, if you didn't sign in, and please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Sack.